Edexcel Economics, paper 2, your macroeconomics paper. Let's get right on with it and get started with section A. So straight away, it looks like we have a bit of a graph, a bit of a diagram if you want to call it. Let's go straight to the question. With the reference, so we call it a chart, with the reference to the chart above, which one of the following is correct? So multiple choice question, let's have a shot at this. UK household savings as a percentage of household disposable income fell in 2015. So let's see what the chart is asking us. UK household savings as a percentage of household disposable income from quarter 1 of 2015 to quarter 3 of 2021. So the first option is saying that UK household savings as a percentage of household disposable income fell in 2015. Let's have a look at 2015. And of course, as you can see, in this 2015 time period, the household savings did rise instead of fall. Therefore, A would of course be wrong. Moving on to B, fell throughout the time period shown. That would not be correct, since of course we can see there's lots of ups and downs, lots of peaks and troughs, which of course is fluctuation. So it would not be B. Then C, the UK household savings as a percentage of household income, disposable income, was highest in quarter 1 of 2017, which was here, which is of course not true, since there's a much higher point here and pretty much anywhere else on the diagram. So that is not correct. That must mean the answer is D, but let's check why the answer is D. They were highest during quarter 2 of 2020, which does that align with this point? Which it does. And of course, that would mean that the answer to 1A is D. Very easy, very simple multiple choice question. Let's keep going. Let's keep this momentum. So calculate the total amount of money saved by the average household in quarter 4 of 2015. And it's given us a little stimulus. In quarter 4 of 2015, the average household disposable income was 26,300. So of course, we're going to have to use the graph to work out the percentage that they'll save. So let's have a look at that. So quarter 4 of 2015, which is of course here, we'll go up from there, which gives us 10%. So this is a very easy 2 marks. All we have to do is do 26,300 divided by 100 times 10, or you can literally divide it by 10, which will give us £2,630. Remember the units, and that would be the total amount of money saved by the average household. Why? This is the household's disposable income, and this chart, this graph, of course shows the household savings as a percentage of their income. Therefore, it would just be 10% of that 26,300, which gives us 2,630. Let's keep going. Explain one likely reason for the change in the total household savings from quarter 1 of 2020 to quarter 2 of 2020. Now, even without looking at the graph, I can tell you how to get these 2 marks. Why? Since 2020, what is it very popular for? Of course, the pandemic. And what is going to happen to savings during the pandemic? When we're in lockdown, what's going to happen? Of course, consumption dropped massively. Why? Since individuals were literally not able to spend their money. They weren't able to go out there was lockdown, they weren't able to consume, and other things, like there was a massive decrease in consumer confidence due to those massive uncertainty in the economy. So individuals, for example, some people losing their jobs, so they wanted to make sure their future is secure. So instead of just spending, they try to save as much money as possible. So of course, that would be enough to get you 2 marks. So just checking the graph, quarter 1 to quarter 2, and we have in quarter 1 of 2020, we have about a 7%, and then we have a much higher, like about 22.5% there. So yeah, of course, massive increase. So let's write this down. Yeah, so this is more than enough for the 2 marks. So essentially, due to the pandemic, the lockdown stopped individuals consuming because they literally couldn't go out, and then also there was a massive due to the uncertainty in the economy, consumer confidence did also fall. But yeah, that is more than enough for this question 1 of the section A, and that's how to get 5 out of 5 marks. Moving on to question 2, we have another big graph, and let's have a look at what the question is asking us. Which of the following is the percentage point fall in investment between 2020 and July 2020? So what is this graph showing us? Investment in the EU as a percentage of GDP from Jan 2019 to October 2020. So let's have a look at these. So percentage point fall, and especially for those of you who've done the past papers, percentage point fall is an important. The point is an important word, as percentage change, of course, is very different to percentage point fall. And especially if you guys have watched all the past paper videos, I believe it might be 2017 where a common mistake by most, I think most students who did that paper made the mistake, instead of calculating a percentage change, they calculated the raw percentage point, which of course would mean they did not get the mark. But anyway, so between April 2020 and July 2020, which is between these 2 points. So it fell, so it's basically 23.5 take away 21.4, which would give me 2.1, which of course it is option C. So that's very easy, very quick, 1 mark there, and let's keep going. So with reference to the data, explain one likely effect of the fall in investment in 2020. 4-mark question. So first thing that I always think about with 4-mark questions, remember your application mark. So let's see the fall of investment in 2020. So in January we had 24.2, and by the end of 2020, which is October, it shows here, we had 20.8. So just in 2020 we had about 3.4% percentage point decrease in investment, and of course this is a very simple, very quick chain of analysis. And what is an effect of a fall in investment? Of course you can say a decrease in real GDP. Why? And very simply to put it, a decrease in investment. What is investment a component of? It's a component of AD. Of course it makes up the I in the AD formula, C plus I plus G plus X minus M. So a decrease in investment, where as it is a component of AD, will cause AD to shift inwards. And since we're speaking about it and it's 4-mark question, it literally will not even take me 30 seconds. It will be a lot easier just to draw out the diagram. So I'm just going to draw SRAS, AD, and just AD shift again to AD1. So of course real GDP decrease from YE to now Y1. So let's go back to the writing. So as it is a component of AD, this will cause AD to shift inwards from AD to AD1. So then what does that mean? This means real GDP decreases slash you can say economic growth from YE to Y1. And that will be more than enough for an effect question to get those 3 marks. And of course, we do still need 1 mark for application. So I'm just going to add any bit of application. So what did I work out earlier? I worked out that in 2020 we saw a 3.4% decrease in percentage of GDP. So of course, I'm just going to use, and that is how to get 3 marks there. But for that 4th mark is the application mark. I'm just going to use that stat I worked out earlier. So for example, I just need to make sure I quote the right thing here, and that's one big thing they're going to be looking at for your application. GDP didn't fall 3.4%. It's investment as percentage of GDP fell 3.4% in 2020. Now, I would have probably picked up the application marks from just quoting YE to Y1 and then AD inwards from AD to AD1. But of course, with 4-mark questions, always be safe. Always quote that application, and it's very easy, very quick to do. So yeah, that's how to get 5 out of 5 marks on question 2. Let's keep going and let's move on to question 3. So it looks like it's a big stimulus, and I can see the question straight away. It's to market rigging. So 4-mark question, explain what is meant by market rigging. So a bit on financial markets here. So let's have a read of the stimulus. So Barclays and JP Morgan have been fined more than 1 billion by the EU CMA for rigging foreign exchange markets. They'd use the online chat rooms to share information about customers' orders, prices, and other trading activities to manipulate the currency market. So of course, in my years of experience with the economics, I have concluded one thing, that students hate financial markets, but 4.4.2, that is a spec point. Please do make sure you know that. And what do we learn in 4.4.2 about market rigging? Market rigging is a type of financial market failure. So that is the first point I'm going to write. So of course, just like all other 4-mark questions, there is going to be marks reserved for application. So do make sure to use a simple stimulus. I'm going to use the online chat rooms. Why? Since of course, this is how they did the market rigging. The online chat rooms, they allowed for basically an information gap. And what type of information gap was this? If we think about it, since Barclays, JP Morgan were in on it, and for example a normal trader was not in on it, it's a form of asymmetric information, where one party has more information than another party. And what would have been the outcome of this? Why were they doing this? Of course, these traders, these JP Morgan, Barclays traders, would have made lots of money, and the normal traders, the normal consumers, would have lost out on a lot of money. So that would be my last point. And of course, since there were different banks included, this is obviously they're colluding together also. But that is how to get 4 marks on that question 3. Quite a simple, straightforward question if you do know your content knowledge on financial markets. But let's move on to the last bit of this question 3. Which of the following is a role of financial markets? And again, 4.4.2, you need to know the spec point. So let's go through the options. A, discourage saving. Of course, you don't even need to revise the spec to know that one is definitely not discourage saving. Number 2, B, promote moral hazard. Of course, if you learn about moral hazard, we try to avoid moral hazard, so therefore it will not be B. C, provide forward markets. Now, it could be that. And then D is to restrict free trade. Of course, that's another very simple one. Of course, that is not true. So the answer, therefore, via process of elimination, would be C. And a quick bit of revision, what are forward markets? Is where firms agree on a price today for an asset in the future. A great example of this is like fuel, for example, maybe car firms or like airlines, for example. They sign contracts with regards to fuel many months in the future. Why do they do this? It increases certainty in the market, since of course fuel prices are extremely volatile, therefore and these firms need to have set numbers. Therefore, to reduce volatility, to reduce uncertainty, they say in 6 months we will pay £100 for a barrel of your oil. Even if they go up to £100, 120, they will only pay £100 since they've pre-negotiated this contract, pre-negotiated the term. So the main role of forward markets is to reduce risk for these firms and provide more certainty. Okay, and let's keep going. So question 4. So we've got a little business cycle, or you could call it a trade cycle. Which point on the trade cycle diagram above illustrates a boom? Now, this is probably my favorite diagram in macro, so if you get this question wrong, I will be personally offended. And of course the answer is C, that is the boom phase. Now let's quickly go through what the other phases are. So of course B, the complete opposite, would be a recession. Now the main thing with a recession is, how do you define a recession? That is a common pitfall for students. It is 2 or more consecutive quarters of negative economic growth. So quarter 1 and quarter 2, if you both have negative economic growth, that is a recession. If quarter 1 you have negative economic growth and quarter 2 you do not, but quarter 3 you have negative economic growth, that's still not a recession. 2 consecutive quarters. And you can say A and D represent a slump or a slowdown, but again, they're never going to be right. So yeah, let's keep going. So now we have a 4-part question. Calculate the total increase in AD from an increase in government spending of 60 million, and then it's given us a bit of a stimulus. So June 2020 estimated the marginal propensity to consume, so MPC, in the UK was 0.1. And this is why I encourage going through every single past paper. If you've practiced this section, this is 4 marks, but you can pretty much get this done in a minute, as it's extremely simple. So of course, it mentions MPC, it talks about aggregate demand, government spending. How are we going to use this MPC formula? Of course, we're going to use the multiplier formula, and there's lots of different multiplier formulas, but the main one and the simplest one is 1 divided by 1 takeaway MPC. So let's put in that marginal propensity to consume into our calculators. So 1 divided by 1 takeaway is 0.1, which will give us 1.1 recurring. Then what are we going to do with that 1.1 recurring? We're going to, of course, we have an increase in government spending of 60 million, so we're going to times that by 60 million. So let me just add the zeros, which is going to give me 66.6 recurring million. And let's just make sure I add in all my units. So 66.6, I'm going to just put 67 million. And of course, this would be in British pounds. And that is my answer. And as simple as that, literally takes under a minute, especially if you practice these questions. Such a simple time saver question and a bank of 4 marks. And that is how to get 5 out of 5 marks on this question 4. Let's keep moving and go into question 5. So explain the likely impact of this tariff on the steel market in the US. It's a 4-mark question again. So in March 2018, the US imposed a 25% tariff on steel imports from the UK. So what's the impact of this tariff? Let's be really simple. You can probably pick up all these marks with a diagram, but I'm just going to quickly explain it, since I think it'll be a bit faster to just write these points out then drawing a diagram. What is a tariff? A tariff is, of course, a tax on imports. And what is the simplest thing this tariff will do? It will increase the price of imported steel, therefore decrease the quantity imported from the UK. Now, why has the US done this? What is the reason behind setting these tariffs, setting these trade barriers like quota subsidies to domestic producers? It is to protect domestic industries. So that is the way I'm going to conclude this. This protects domestic industries, keeping US employment in the steel industry high. Okay, so I've written that out. Let me just quickly go through it. Tariff is a tax on imports. This will increase the price of imported steel. 25% tariff, that is my application mark there, thus reducing the quantity imported of steel. This protects the US steel firms, as consumers will substitute away from the UK to the US steel, thus increasing the demand for domestic steel, thus increasing domestic employment and essentially protecting the domestic industry. And that is more than enough to get 4 out of 4 marks there. And let's keep going, let's keep this motion. And there is a multiple choice question to conclude this section A. So which of the following is likely to give the US a comparative advantage in steel production? An increase in corporation tax in the US, that of course would be wrong. Tax is a cost, you're basically increasing the cost. B is economic growth within the US. It's not really likely to do anything. Increased productivity of the US steel workers. Yes, I do agree with that. If they're more productive, what is productivity? Output per unit. They can produce more output per unit time, thus meaning that they can produce more steel. Then lastly, increase in wages of steel workers in the US. No, that would not increase the comparative advantage. Why? It means it's more costly since wages are a cost. With higher costs, it reduces the degree of their comparative advantage. But yeah, so the answer will be C there, and that is how to conclude. Firstly, I'd get 5 out of 5 on this 5-mark question, and then I'd get 25 out of 25 on this section A. Let's keep going and let's move on to section B. Section B, 2024, paper 2. Let's get right on with it and go straight to that 5-mark question. Okay, so 6A, 5 marks, let's get started. With reference to figure 4 and your own knowledge, explain the distinction between a progressive and a regressive tax. Now, at the time of recording is 2025, and this was last year's paper, and this question was answered horribly by students, and most students dropped a mark here. And why is that? This is because a quirk in the Edexcel exam board. Edexcel examiners are extremely specific with these definitions for progressive and regressive tax. But like I always say, past paper questions come up again year on year. So now you've looked at this question, you've seen this question, it is your duty now to revise and maybe make a flashcard on these specific definitions I will give you, as if this question comes up again, it could come up in your section A, it could come up in section B, even section C maybe. You want to make sure you're smashing out that definition and not dropping stupid marks on a definition, especially when it's come in a past paper. There's no excuse now. So let's get started with the question. And so essentially it's asking us to define progressive and regressive taxes, but it's always also asking us to use figure 4. So let's find figure 4 and have a good look at it. So figure 4 is referring to income tax rates for 2023 compared to 2022, and of course if your real world application is strong, what happened between these two times? Of course, the highest band of income tax dropped £25,000 in value almost. So essentially, to be taxed at the highest rate, which is 45%, you no longer have to make 150,000. You can now make over 120, anything over 125,000, you will be taxed at the highest income tax rate. What does this table show? It shows between 2022 and 2023 the highest rate of income tax, which is 45%. The bracket for it decreased about 25,000. So before you had to earn anything over 150,000 was taxed at 45%. Now anything over 125,000 approximately is taxed 45%. Now I use this table all the time in my life classes. Why? It is so good for application, and it's not just the table itself, it's knowing that depth of application, and if you can show this depth of knowledge to your examiner, you can really blow them away. So a great bit of detail with this income tax table is individuals earning this top rate, so over £125,114. They undergo this phenomenon called tampering of the personal allowance. I'm sure a few of you have no idea what the personal allowance is, but quite simply, this is the personal allowance. So in the UK, you can earn up to £12,570 every fiscal year untaxed, and that's what we refer to our personal allowance as. And the main precursor to all this knowledge is I hope you actually understand how these income tax work. So if I make £51,000, that does not mean I pay 40% income tax on all my income. That means I only pay 40% on that £1,000 over I earn 50,000. So the £800 I earn over 50,271, I pay that 40% income tax. So you need to make sure you understand how a progressive tax system actually works. Now, you need to make sure you actually understand how a progressive tax system works, as if you don't understand how it works, you're never going to be able to explain it. So, for example, if I made £80,000 in a fiscal year and I had to pay tax on that, I would pay £19,000 and around £400 of tax. Now, use this tax system, use this table, and try work that out. Now, if you're really stuck with that, and I get a few comments on this, I might make a separate video on how to work that out. But yeah, do let me know in the comments. But anyway, back to the real world application. So, like I said, individuals earning over £125,000 lose their personal allowance. Now, this means we call this tampering of the personal allowance, but effectively, now, if we talk about the effective tax rates, since they have lost their personal allowance, since they've lost £12,000 where they're paying zero tax, this is now an effective 60% tax rate. So it's labelled as a 45% tax rate, but due to the added information that they lose their personal allowance, this is actually a 60% tax rate, which is a great bit of application you can include in your essays, and it really does show your examiner you have a great appreciation for the real world of economics, because this table is clearly telling you that there's a 45% tax rate, but when you're writing maybe an essay on this, maybe a different section B question, where it's asking you about tax rates, maybe asking you about inequality, maybe asking you how the tax revenue is generated, you can talk about how this highest tax band is actually effectively 60% rather than, as stated, 45%. And just like the next question in this section B mentions fiscal drag, they can 100%, I would not be surprised, they give you a question on something like this, they ask you to comment on it, ask you to explain it, and so this is why I emphasize real world application so much. So like I said, back onto the question, and the first thing I'm going to do is simply just define progressive and regressive tax. And remember, in 5-mark questions, you always will have marks for application. So again, it's really simple content knowledge. Make sure to check out the flashcards on youdoecon.com, as I will be have great examples for this. But then I'm going to define progressive tax, give an example, define regressive tax, give an example, then explain the slight differences between them. So the way I define progressive tax is the proportion of income paid. So it's all about the proportions, because they talk about the average tax rate, but the proportion of income paid as tax increases as incomes rise. And why is that? Since higher earners are taxed at higher rates, which is pretty much the same thing, as higher earners basically carry a larger size of the tax burden. So how would I define this? The way I defined it is the proportion of income paid, and remember, it's all to do with the proportion of income paid, since there's that distinction between the average tax rate and the marginal tax rate. But the proportion of income paid as tax increases as incomes rise. And why is that? Since higher earners are taxed at higher rates, or just another way of saying that, higher earners carry a higher tax burden. Now, of course, income tax is an example of a progressive tax, but if you know the examples, why would you not include them? Corporation tax is also a great example of progressive tax. Why? Since if a company is making less than 50,000 profit, they are taxed at a 19% corporation tax rate, whereas if they make more than £250,000 worth of profits a year, they are taxed at a 25% tax rate. So the definition for regressive tax is pretty much exactly the same. You change two words, which you change increases to decreases, and you change higher earners to lower earners. So how does it sound? The proportion of income paid as tax decreases as income rise, since lower earners are taxed at higher rates, carry a higher tax burden. And the way to imagine it, you're taxing poorer people, the low income earners, lots, and the rich people, the high income earners, a very small amount. So of course it's quite a backward system. But what are some examples in the UK of regressive taxes? Of course we have national insurance, but a great one, and a great especially when we're doing the inequality essays, very high emphasis in the live classes, as you can link this to so many things. We link regressive taxes to VAT, then you can link it to the Lorenz curve, the Gini coefficients, and it's a great link and it's a great amount of depth. But yeah, of course, the VAT in the UK, which is 20%, is a regressive tax. And why is VAT a regressive tax? As it disproportionately affects the low income earners. Since VAT is a flat rate tax, it's 20% on all goods and services. An individual can be making £100,000 a year, and an individual can be making £10,000 a year, but they will pay the same rate of VAT. What does this mean? That VAT is a higher proportion of the £10,000 worker earner's income. So therefore, it's a higher proportion of his income, therefore it disproportionately affects him, whereas a £100,000 earner, it's a much smaller percentage of his income, therefore affects him much less. Therefore, this is why we call VAT a regressive tax. And thus, these regressive tax, of course, increase inequality, which goes against the macro objectives. But anyway, with this question, we still would not have full marks. Since why? The question is not just asking us to define, it's asking us to explain the distinction. So what makes these two different between a progressive and a regressive tax? And I think a really good way to distinguish them is, of course, the biggest link is inequality. So you can talk about how a progressive tax system, of course, would decrease the levels of inequality within the country, since of course low income earners are taxed less, whereas a regressive tax would increase the levels of income inequality. And of course you can link it to our links in inequality, which are things like the Lorenz curve, Gini coefficient. Okay, and that is how to get 5 out of 5 marks on this 5-mark question. To summarise it all, I've just said progressive tax would reduce the level of income inequality, which of course means a lower Gini coefficient value, and then the opposite for regressive tax. If I was doing this in the exam, I would of course write it out. So regressive tax would increase the levels of income inequality, thus resulting in a higher Gini coefficient value. But yeah, really good 5-mark question, especially for revision. If you drop marks on it initially, do not worry, it's a great one, but make sure you improve from it. That's the main thing with this. But yeah, let's now move on to the 8-mark question. So 8-mark question. With reference to figure 4, again, and extract A, examine the likely impact of the freeze in income tax thresholds on aggregate demand. Now, a great question, and it just makes me smile, this question does, since how embedded it is in a real-world application. So I mentioned it in the previous question, but for those of you who don't know, the freeze in income tax thresholds is of course referring to the concept of fiscal drag. Now, that is of course embedded in real-world application, but it's really funny since it reminds me of last year, where which is the year we sat this paper. I did a live class specifically on the concept of fiscal drag, since it was very popular in the news and it's just a very good bit of real-world application. And I had a lot of students asking me, why are we learning about this? It is not in the spec. But this is the thing with Edexcel, and since it links so much to the spec, yes, it's not explicitly stated in the spec, but it's some really good real world application that you can back your points up with. And in that exact year, it came up in their exam paper, and since they knew about it, they could score so much better on this question rather than if it was the first time you're looking at it. Now, I understand I'm always emphasising real-world application, but it pays absolute dividends. If you understand the macroeconomy, you know your examples for the globalisation section, if you know your countries, for micro, if you know your industries. I've been through so many A-star students now, and it's just what is needed for that A-star, that top level. It just shows the examiner of that depth of knowledge and that appreciation of the real world, not just the theory of economics, the real world application of that theory. And it's those two things combined which makes that A-star student. Whereas on the opposite side of the spectrum, if you don't know what fiscal drag is, it's going to take you a hell of a lot of time to understand what they actually mean by freezing the income tax bands. You have to read the extract, fully internalise what that means, and that will just take time on time. Now, in this paper, there were students who saw the freeze in income tax thresholds, didn't know what fiscal drag was, and thought the question was asking them or telling them that they're going to completely get rid, almost, of income tax thresholds for a short period of time, which is totally unreasonable, of course would not happen. But if they answer it like that, of course they cannot pick up any marks, and again it shows the importance of that real world application. But let's go on to explaining what actually this concept of freezing the income tax thresholds actually does. So fiscal drag occurs when the government freeze income tax bands. That has been done right now by the government, where they are frozen until 2029. This means the income tax bands do not rise in line with inflation. So more individuals are dragged into higher income tax bands, which is why we call it fiscal drag. They're dragged into higher income tax bands, even though realistically, in real terms, in purchasing power terms, the income hasn't increased or maybe has decreased. So to make sure you never forget this concept, let me explain this really simply. So in 2022, if you have a salary of £48,000, but then in 2023, as you know, there's high levels of inflation. So due to inflation, if your wage rises, and for example, if your wage now rises by £4,000, so in 2022 you were earning £48,000, and in 2023 now you are earning £52,000. Now, the main thing to remember, your wage has risen in line with inflation. You are not in real terms actually making more money, since goods and services are just more expensive now. So for the same purchasing power, they need to pay you slightly more money. So essentially things just cost more, you are not making more money in real terms. But now let's have a quick look at the income tax bands again. So now, since you're making £52,000, a part of your income has now passed into this 40% tax bracket. Thus meaning now, on part of your income, you're paying a 40% tax rate. Therefore, you're paying more tax, even though in real terms, you're not better off. So therefore, in terms of this example, you actually become poorer in real terms. Your real income actually decreases due to fiscal drag. And this is the exact reason why Rishi Sunak, when he was the Chancellor in 2021, he froze his income tax bands, as it's estimated each year in 2025, it will bring the government 8.9 billion worth of tax revenue. And since they froze until 2029, it's estimated this will bring, cumulatively, it will bring the government almost £30 billion worth of tax revenue. And why is this so clever? as this is a way the government can increase taxes without putting the headline out that tax rates have increased, whereas in reality, even though you are paying more tax. So it's very clever by the government, but of course. So let's actually get on with answering the question. If you want to, you can start by defining fiscal drag, but if you want to be really transactional, really efficient, really quick, you can just get straight on with answering the question. So what is the main thing I've just explained to you? What is the main effect of fiscal drag? Of course, individuals are pushed into higher income tax bands. Therefore, the main thing is that they have a reduction in their disposable income. So that's the first thing I would say. The first impact is there's a reduction in disposable income, then explain why, like I've just said. So the way I'd structure my answer to this question is firstly, explain the concept of fiscal drag. And once you've explained the concept of fiscal drag, of course, fiscal drag ends at individuals in real terms, the amount of income they're earning decreases. So therefore, as they're paying more income tax, it means that their disposable income is decreasing. And the question is asking the effects on AD, so it's very simple from here. If disposable income is decreasing, of course, that is going to lead to less consumption. And if there's less consumption, 100%, very easy to do. Add in a little ADAS diagram. So of course, on this AD diagram, you can mention, since there's less consumption, consumption makes up around 60% of the AD formula. Therefore, it causes AD to shift inwards to AD1, thus causing a decrease in real GDP. So of course, that is how to pick up your content knowledge marks and your analysis marks. But of course, the question is referring to figure 4 and extract A. So I would just have a scan through figure 4 and extract A and just find any stats that are relevant and add them in. So of course, this is a great stat here. 250,000 more taxpayers were pushed into the additional tax band. Of course, that does represent the freezing of income tax bands. It represents fiscal drag. So we've brought up fiscal drag, you can add in that bit, that small example. Also, this last bit about the Chancellor saying that individuals making 150,000 will now pay 1,200 more in income tax. And why is that? Of course, since we learn in figure 4 that the band is decreasing from 150 to 125,000. Therefore, the people who are making 150 will now, that £25,000 extra will be taxed at 45% instead of 40%. So yeah, two great bits of application there. Add them in, and that is how to get 6 marks on your KAA. And of course, on your 8-mark question, you will still have 2 evaluation marks. So let's try find some evaluation. Okay, so with regards to evaluation, of course, like I always say, read through your chain of analysis, find any limitations, any assumptions, and evaluate them. First thing first is the main reason why, and remember the question is about aggregate demand decreasing. That's the main link we're making in the question. But the reason why in the question, in the chain of analysis, that aggregate demand decreases is due to less consumption. But also, what are some of the other components of aggregate demand? Of course, the aggregate demand formula, which I hope you know by now, is C plus I plus G plus X minus M. Therefore, you could say, however, in evaluation, this depends whether the reduction in consumption could be offset by the increase in government spending. Since, of course, this fiscal drag phenomenon is bringing the government lots more tax revenue. Therefore, with this massive increase in tax revenue, they could pump a lot more government spending into the economy. Therefore, that could actually reduce the effect on AD, maybe cause actually AD to shift out. So it depends on the relative impacts of the reduction in consumption versus the increase in government spending. So it's a really good and a really developed evaluation point. Another evaluation point is to do with fiscal drag itself. So one of the main assumptions of fiscal drag is that wages will rise in line with inflation. But for example, maybe one year there's 0% inflation rate, or even in COVID, the wage growth was around 6%. But like I said, there was 8 months of consecutive double-digit inflation. So wages were not rising exactly in line with inflation. Therefore, that limits the effects of fiscal drag, as individuals are not dragged that much into higher tax bands, since wages are not rising as much for them to rise into the next tax band. So therefore, that limits the effectiveness, the effect of fiscal drag, as fiscal drag relies on inflation to increase individual wages, thus them being pushed into higher income tax brackets. But yeah, that is enough for the 8-mark question. I think I've hit you with a lot of information in these last 2 questions, but it's a great paper for practice. Let's get on with the 10-mark question. Assess whether a fiscal deficit and national debt should be a concern for the UK government. Now, for the 10-mark questions, I usually suggest split it into 2 paragraphs. 100% you can achieve 10 out of 10 with 1 paragraph, but it just makes it clearer. So, first paragraph, I would do it on the fiscal deficit. Second paragraph, the concerns with national debt. Now, I can imagine a lot of students won't actually know the difference between these two. Essentially, a fiscal deficit is just what we refer to with the budget. So when we have a budget deficit, so when government spending exceeds tax revenue, and that is yearly, the fiscal deficit is a yearly deficit. And national debt is essentially an accumulation of all our fiscal deficits over the years. Now, whenever these questions do not prompt you to an extract, that does not mean you do not need the extract. That means now you just have to go and find the extract, which is relevant to. So the first thing I always do is just look at the titles. So UK monetary policy decisions probably won't be most relevant to that. Freezing income tax bans, again, probably is not most relevant. UK fiscal deficit, that looks like a good one for application, so we'll be using that one. And then UK national debt, of course, another really good one. So even if there's no reference to extracts, 100% there will be some mention of it in the extracts, so do go and look for it. And then, of course, the one I actually missed out, interest rates, since, of course, national debt has a massive link to borrowing, to interest rates, so therefore we could also use this. So how would I structure this paragraph? Why is fiscal deficit a concern? I'd firstly just explain what fiscal deficit is, like I already have to you guys. So when government spending exceeds government tax revenue, therefore this creates a gap which the government has to cover. How do they cover this gap? They take on debt, they borrow money. And by the government taking on debt, what does this mean? This increases the servicing cost of the debt. Essentially, it increases the repayment cost of the debt, since if you take on more debt, you have more to repay in the future. Therefore, if the government has more repayment costs, it means the government has less money to allocate to different sectors of the economy. And also, a massive thing which was during COVID is this concept of fiscal headroom. Rishi Sunak was really emphasising it, and even right now, the OBR are emphasising the lack of fiscal headroom in the UK. Fiscal headroom is essentially how many funds the government has to respond to an external shock. And the reason why they were emphasising it so much in COVID, of course, COVID was a massive external shock, which it wiped out lots of the government's funds. Therefore, they wanted to be prepared if another external shock hit them, the government could respond appropriately. Since things like monetary policy, fiscal policy, they require time, they require funds for the government to put them into place. Things like furlough scheme, the government needs to have money to initiate these schemes and help save the economy, essentially. So with less fiscal headroom, the government has less ability to respond to external shock. I don't do this a lot, but I've written out the chain of analysis, typed it out, so you guys can see it a bit more clearly. So fiscal deficit is a concern. Why? It arises when government spending is greater than tax revenue. I've written in like a chain of analysis, so the arrows are like chains. So forcing the government to borrow and add to the national debt. This raises debt servicing and repayment costs, leaving fewer funds available for other priorities and reducing fiscal headroom. And this is why it's so important. This limits the UK's ability to respond to external shocks. And like I said, it happened a lot, especially during COVID, and even right now it's happening. But when Rishi Sunak tightened the UK's fiscal policy after Truss's mini budget, which of course she left, I think, a 40 billion black hole. Moving on, 4 marks for evaluation in your 10-mark question. So let's get started with our first one. This is very specific to do with fiscal deficit. Of course, there are 2 different types of budget deficit. There is a structural and there is cyclical. And one of them is quite bad and one of them is not so bad. So we are going to evaluate using that. So however, in evaluation, this depends on the type of fiscal/budget deficit. And of course, just before I move on to evaluation, for that first paragraph, 100% use this figure to quote a few of these stats. Maybe quote the difference between 2001 and 2020, maybe the percentage point difference, maybe the actual percentage change. 100% use this figure to pick up those application marks. Remember, there are 2 application marks here, so at least 1 bit of application in this paragraph and another bit of application in the second paragraph. But yeah, back to this. How in evaluation, this depends on the type of fiscal deficit. As if we have a cyclical fiscal deficit, this only occurs in the downturns of the economic cycle. For example, in a recession. This means when the economy recovers, when we get back to the tax revenues would rise, welfare spending, for example, on benefits would fall. Therefore, it reduces the need for government to borrow money to finance that deficit. Now, that is a perfect evaluation point, but unfortunately, it's completely theoretical. It doesn't matter for this question, it would get you the mark, so very transactional, it's fine. But if you want some real-world application, the UK's budget deficit, the fiscal deficit, is 100% structural. Therefore, that is the main reason for concern. As it's a structural deficit, even when we come into the boom phase of the business cycle, it means that we are still in deficit. So every single stage of the business cycle, we are racking up debt. And remember, national debt is just an accumulation of these fiscal deficits. So every stage of the business cycle, we are increasing our national debt, of course, leading to these problems of increased repayment costs and several other problems. Okay, so moving on to the second paragraph for this 10-mark question on national debt, I'm going to take a bit of a different route in answering this paragraph. I'm going to focus more on how national debt reduces the government's ability to achieve its macro objective of economic growth. So let's get right on with it. Why is national debt a concern? So just like the first paragraph, national debt is of course a concern. National debt is an accumulation of fiscal deficits, but it is a concern since it increases repayment costs. As when we take on more debt, we have to borrow more from the financial markets. And what are the two specific repayment costs that increase? Firstly, we have debt servicing costs, and then we also have an increase in repayment costs. Now, for your depth of understanding and to be able to explain a chain of analysis in a step-by-step manner, you have to actually understand what these words mean. And whatever you're writing, even with diagrams, that's why I always emphasize really understanding that deeper level of understanding with diagrams, as if you don't understand the backstory, the actual what the curves mean. So for example, in market failure, what demand equals MPB means, what supply equals marginal private cost actually means, it's very hard for you to then go and explain that in a step-by-step manner to pick up those top level of marks. So firstly, debt servicing cost is just the interest cost of the debt, so how much interest the government pays yearly on that debt. But then we have the second cost, which is of course repayment costs, which is the actual cost to the government of repaying back that debt. So the government have set an objective to reduce debt as a percentage of GDP. So debt as a percentage of GDP is around 100% right now. But one of the main problems, and of course it's looking like a massive struggle to reduce that, and one of the main problems with that is that when our bonds mature, the government does not pay back, does not fulfill that repayment cost using tax revenue. The government fulfills that repayment cost by just issuing new bonds. So they issue new bonds to pay off the old bonds. Essentially, they're taking out debt to pay off debt, which of course, as you can imagine, sounds quite negative and leads to, again, just more problems in the future, more problems with increased repayment cost, increased servicing costs. A great diagram here which links to all of this is, of course, I'll draw it out and let's see if any of you guys can guess it. So it's quantity of loanable funds on the x-axis, and then on the y-axis we have interest rate, and then we have supply, and we'll label this supply of loanable funds, and we have demand for loanable funds. Now, like I said, when the government have increased repayment cost, they use debt to pay off debt. So to pay off the existing debt, they will take out more loans, they will take out more debt to pay off this existing debt. So what does that lead to? This increases the demand for loanable funds. This increases the demand for debt. And how can we show that? We can show that on this diagram, which is of course for those of you who do not know, this is the crowding out diagram. And what does this show? So when we take on more debt, it causes the demand for loanable funds to shift from DLF1, so demand for loanable funds 1, to DLF2, which we can show by outward shift there. And how does this affect? And let's see what effect this has on the axes. So quantity of loanable funds of course increases, but then the main axis, which is the y-axis, let's see what happens there. So interest rates increases from IR1 to now IR2. Of course, I've mentioned interest rates increasing on the diagram, but I do want to pick up those application marks as well. So I am going to mention, for example, just two random points. From August 2022, interest rates on a government bond went from around 1.8% to then in mid to late September went to 4.5%. So great above application then. But also at the start of my paragraph, of course, I talk about national debt as a concern. So I could work out the difference between national debt in 2001 versus 2020, maybe calculate percentage change, maybe percentage point difference. So of course, as you can see, it's about 27% there, and in 2020 it is around 92%. So you can take 92% away from 26% and just say, E.G, national debt has increased as a percentage of GDP from 2001 to 2020 by, what is it, like 70%? So about a 65% decrease in national debt. So about a 65% percentage point increase as a percentage of GDP in national debt, of course, at the start of your paragraph would be great and would help you pick up those application marks, of course. So I'll just pull out 2 points there. So July 2022, it was about 2% the government bond yield, and then in September, it was around 4.5%, which of course is around a 2.5% increase. And for some real world application, that was of course due to trustonomics, which it just Liz Truss's mini budget failure, of course, led to the increase in the interest rate on government bonds. I'm not sure I pronounced her name right, but Liz Truss mini budget failure essentially caused the spike in interest rates on government bonds. Now linking back to my main point, how is an increase in interest rate going to reduce economic growth? And the first step to that is of course private firms. So an increase in interest rate is going to disincentivize private firms investing. Why? Since there's increased repayment costs when they invest, interest rates are higher, which of course will increase cost of borrowing, which disincentivizes private firms. And of course, if private firms are disincentivized to invest, this is going to reduce investment, and of course, investment is a component of AD, which causes AD to decrease. And if AD decreases, of course, if you're going to look at it on a diagram, real GDP, and of course you can draw LRS, whichever one you want, honestly. AD decreases from AD to AD1, of course, which if we extend out this, we see a decrease in real GDP from YE to Y1, thus increasing levels of national debt would therefore, at the end, it would cause an increase in interest rates. It would cause essentially the crowding out effect, which therefore would cause a reduction in real GDP, meaning the government would be worsening their macro objective of economic growth. Yep, so that's a little summary of how I would tackle that chain of analysis. Sorry if this is a bit messy at the end, but it's like arrows. I like the. Now, of course, this does look quite overwhelming as a second paragraph for a 10-mark question, especially with the time constraints. But I present you with a perfect example, the A-star example. As the more times we go through these like perfect A-star examples, it will like by osmosis you'll pick them up. Since if you're exposed to these ideas, these high-level chains of analysis, when you're writing yourself, a few of these ideas will pop into your mind as well. So don't worry too much about maybe writing this depth, this much knowledge. It's just about trying to pick up as much as possible. And just lastly, just to quickly finish off with evaluation. Now, of course, we did evaluate in quite a lot of depth in the last paragraph, so you won't need much here. One simple evaluation point should do. And of course, what is the best Keynesian evaluation to crowding out? It is, of course, the opposite of it, the crowding in effect. Essentially, crowding out suggests that when the government spends, of course, they spend via borrowing. This, like I just explained to you, this will increase the interest rates, therefore cause private firms to reduce their investment, to reduce their intervention in the economy, since they're disincentivized by higher repayment costs. Whereas the crowding in effect suggests when government spending is high, when the government is investing into the economy, this will foster private firms to invest even more rather than disincentivize them. As of course, with the government investing is going to increase the real GDP. When there's increase in real GDP, there's more demand for firms, there's high levels of employment, and all these could lead to increased profit for firms. And firms, again, what is the classical economic assumption? They are profit maximizers. They want to be a part of this increased profit. They want to boost their profit for shareholders, so they will actually increase intervention, increase investment in the economy when the government is also spending highly. A great bit of real world application you can back this up with is of course France. France is renowned for its high levels of public investment. For example, I think it spends 4% of GDP each year on public infrastructure, on public expenditure. Also, it has very high levels of private firm investment, so it does show the opposite of crowding out. It shows that this high level of public sector investment does actually lead to firms investing more. As you can imagine, for example, if the French government invests in something like public infrastructure, it means that, for example, workers can get to their location quicker. More workers, there's less geographical immobility, there's less transport costs for firms. For example, when they're transporting goods, it takes less time, it's more safe, etc. So yeah, that is the crowding in effect, and that's how I would evaluate that last paragraph for the 10-mark question. Moving on to the 12-mark question. With reference to extract B, discuss the use of quantitative easing in preventing deflation. Now, on first glance, that sounds like a really good question. It will allow you to really demonstrate that knowledge you have on quantitative easing, and it backed up by an extract as well. Sounds like a really good 12-mark question there. So let's have a quick scan through extract B to see if there's anything with regards to quantitative easing preventing deflation. Okay, so extract B is quite large, so we'll have a quick scan through this. So first mention here, it voted to reduce base interest rate to 0.1% and restart the quantitative easing program by buying 200 billion of UK government bonds. So that's of course something we're going to use. And then a really good mention, one line later, is the deep recession. Of course, this is the downturn of the economic cycle, if you think about the business cycle. And of course, during a recession, there's very low employment, there's very low levels of economic growth, and we can get deflationary pressures in a recession. Thus why UK economies and UK government and governments in general pursue expansionary policies during recessions to try limit the effects of deflation. And of course, reducing interest rate is a great example of expansionary monetary policy. And this is another great point here. So of course, during COVID, we had a massive decrease in real GDP. What does real GDP mean? The amount of goods and services being produced in the economy. And this point mentions the Bank of England decided it was a good time to print lots of money. That was a mistake, as we had too much money being printed, but we didn't have enough goods. We were chasing too few goods. So that could act as a really good evaluation point for this paragraph. And again, two other great evaluation points here. So experts have argued this had pushed inflation to a high level in the UK by stimulating aggregate demand. So if your paragraph, when you're evaluating the effectiveness, the positive effects of QE, you can say, however, in evaluation, this depends on the negative effects. Yes, we solved deflation, but we just got the opposite side of the spectrum. As we want to avoid deflation, of course, the UK's economic target is between 1 and 3%. We don't want deflation, but of course, we do not want higher than 3% inflation rates. So yeah, we didn't get deflation, but we ended up massively high levels of inflation. So you can definitely evaluate the effectiveness, the positive overall effects of quantitative easing. But then later on in this paragraph, it says, however, critics say QE does not cause inflation, as most of the extra money is contained within the financial system. So maybe if you're writing a paragraph on the negatives of QE, you can use this evaluation point also. Let's get started with this first paragraph. Now, QE is a widely understood topic, but not understood well. A lot of students don't actually understand the process behind QE. They kind of know what QE is, but if you were to, and especially in a question like this, to pick up these the higher band, the higher level marks, you really need to understand the process behind QE, as it allows you to connect to the chain of analysis. So let's get started. The first thing, quantitative easing. What is it? Most economic students know what quantitative easing is. It's where new money is created. But now, this is where the specific detail matters. It's where the Bank of England electronically creates new money, and the extract actually references this. And what does the Bank of England do with this money? It uses this to buy government bonds and sometimes corporate bonds. And as you can see in the extract, it mentions this here, quantitative easing program by buying 200 billion worth of government bonds and corporate bonds. Of course, 100% going to quote that. Now, quantitative easing has a big link to bonds. Now, bonds is a very hit and miss topic for students. A lot of students do neglect it, but for your chain of analysis, to be able to explain everything step by step, you need to understand the process behind bonds. So, if the UK government, if the Bank of England spends 200 billion on buying government and corporate bonds, how is it going to affect the bonds? So the price of the bonds, how is it going to affect it? And the yield of the bond. So how is it going to affect the price and the yield of the bond? Of course, if you're clued up on your yield analysis, you will know that the price of the bonds will increase due to increased demand for the bonds, but the yield, the interest rate on the bonds will decrease. Now, by the Bank of England buying these corporate bonds, this increases the liquidity within the banking sector, within the financial sector. Why? Since essentially they've pumped 200 billion worth of new money into the financial sector. Now, if you pump 200 billion worth of new money into the financial sector, what effect is that going to have on the banking sector? It's going to mean the banks have more reserves of money, therefore they have more liquidity. And when banks have more liquidity, they're more likely to lend out, since they have more reserves essentially. And if they're more likely to lend out, they'll give out more mortgages, maybe mortgages to riskier individuals. They'll give out more loans, and of course you can understand the chain of analysis from there. It means there's going to be an increase in income. You can say an increase in consumption. AS analysis, of course, shifting out AD, consumption is 60% of AD, thus causing an increase in real GDP, an increase in price level Y, since we have demand pull inflation, since AD is shifting out. And of course, relating this back to the question, this demand pull inflation is of course the opposite of deflation, therefore it would help prevent that deflation. Now, of course, if banks are giving out loans more easily, if they're giving out more mortgages, it means households have more money to work with, they have more spending power, thus is going to lead to an increase in consumption. And even for firms, you can say interest rates effectively fall as well. As when the bond yield falls, we say the interest rate on bonds falls, and household interest rates usually follow. So therefore you can say firms invest more, so essentially we have an increase in investment by firms, an increase in consumption by firms. Of course, what does that lead to? What does that affect? They're both components of AD, causing AD to shift out to AD1, which of course is going to lead to the main thing, which is demand pull inflation, which is the opposite of deflation, which means we are 100% preventing deflation, and quantitative easing is an effective method to prevent deflation. And that's pretty much how I would write it. The main bit is understanding the process of quantitative easing. Towards the end, when you're talking about the ASAD analysis, you can talk about many different things like increase in marginal propensity to consume, increase in disposable incomes, lots of different ways you can navigate that end chain analysis, even talk about mortgages and mortgage repayment costs. But yeah, so that is the main chain analysis, and that is essentially how to smash out that KA part of that paragraph. Moving on to the evaluation stage of the paragraph. Now, the first evaluation point, I'm just taking it straight from the extract. So of course, there was this point where there was too much money chasing too few goods. Then it pushed inflation higher in the UK by stimulating aggregate demand. I'm going to use those 2 points in my evaluation. Now, the way I'm going to evaluate it is talking about, however, this depends on the quantity of quantitative easing. Since, of course, In the end, the UK used around 895 billion worth of quantitative easing. And as we can see, by these 2 points, I'm going to use these both in my valuation point, quote them directly. We created too much money when we were chasing too few goods. It led to stimulating aggregate demand. Essentially, yes, the economy was in a recession. We had a massive deflation risk, but the government just used way too much quantitative easing, leading to, as we know, a few months later, we saw 8 months of consecutive double-digit inflation with massive inflationary pressures and massive inflationary risks. Yes, we were safe from deflation. We were safe from one negative, but then we went to another massive negative of really high inflation. So it depends on the quantity of quantitative easing used, or you can say it depends on the unintended effects of quantitative easing. Now, with regards to the second evaluation point, I am going to be using one, you could probably call it my favorite diagram, which is, of course, we have time on the x-axis, we have real GDP on the y-axis, and of course it is the business cycle diagram. Why? Since, of course, we pursue quantitative easing during a recession, and during recessions we use expansionary policies like expansionary monetary policy, which is quantitative easing, and interest rates. But what is a problem with the recession, the downturn of the economic cycle? During this time, if we're thinking about consumer confidence is very low. Therefore, if consumer confidence is very low, how could that maybe limit our chain of analysis? The major limitation of low consumer confidence is this, and low consumer confidence, low investor confidence, is it could limit the degree to which we get an increase in consumption and an increase in investment. Why? If consumers are unsure about the economic outlook, the future of the economy, they are very likely to maintain a high savings ratio, meaning that they're not, even if there's lots of money pumped into the economy, even though it's very easy to take out a loan, due to the uncertain economic climate, they are unlikely to significantly increase their consumption and their investment. Therefore, it limits the degree to which AD shifts out, therefore limits the degree to which we actually get any demand pull inflation, or we could actually get no demand pull inflation. We could still be getting negative economic growth and negative deflationary pressures. Therefore, it's a really good evaluation point. So we're with that evaluation point. However, in evaluation, this depends on how the stage of the business cycle, which of course we were at a recession, affects consumer confidence. And if you're able to write that, able to back it up with a diagram, label it up on the diagram, then explain that chain of analysis, explain exactly how it's limited your chain of analysis, it's just an absolute A-star evaluation point and you'll be smashing it. Another great evaluation point, which is actually very topical to the UK economy, is quantitative easing with regards to other government objectives. So yes, quantitative easing will help support the UK's government objective of maintaining stable inflation between 1 and 3%. But then we think about other government objectives, such as inequality. Quantitative easing is extremely bad and it will worsen inequality to a massive degree. Why is that? Quantitative easing essentially reduces bond yields, it reduces the interest rates on bonds, so investors will look to invest into more lucrative assets. Another more lucrative asset is assets. So like houses. This will lead to a massive increase, a massive surge in house prices and a massive increase in demand for houses, which of course, if you think about supply and demand diagram, is going to lead to an increase in the price for houses. Now let's think about which shareholders, which economic backgrounds in the economy hold most of the assets. Of course, low-income individuals usually don't actually even own a house, they rent houses, whilst high-income individuals, they have portfolios of like hundreds of houses. Therefore, by pursuing quantitative easing, it's going to lead to an increase in asset prices, and this increase in asset prices boosts the wealth. It's a positive wealth effect for the individuals who have massive portfolios, who have massive assets, which again just increases that gap between the highest and the lowest income earners, the highest and lowest income backgrounds in society. And you can say it even makes it worse, since the increase in house prices therefore pushes up rental prices, pushes up prices to rent. Therefore, the low income earners in society now are forced with higher rents. Therefore, they have to pay higher rents whilst the richer just get much richer. Therefore, again, increasing that gap between the high and the lowest income earners. And this is a major problem for the UK economy, especially post-COVID, post 895 billion worth of quantitative easing. It led to a massive increase in inequality within the UK. Now, especially if you're studying economics at university, or you just have a massive interest for economics, or just for general real-world application, there's a great YouTube channel which explains this inequality in really good depth and how it's affecting your daily lives. He's called Gary's Economics, you might have heard of him. I'll leave a link in the description to a really good video. It's not needed for your A-level economics. I would class it at this stage as entertainment, but it gives you a really good depth of understanding on the real world of UK economics. Now that is a 12-mark question done. 15-mark question. Discuss supply-side policies in the UK that could be used to stimulate economic growth. Now, this is why I emphasise doing past papers so much, since this question is just repeated all the time. This was the same question in 2023, same question in 2022, and the same question in 2017, and they were all 15-mark questions. Now, of course, every year the question has a bit of a different wording. So for example, in 2022, it was discuss the benefits of an increase in infrastructure spending on the UK. So one of your paragraphs would have been a supply side policy. The 15 marker in 2023 was market orientated strategies that the Angolan government could use to improve development. Yes, you talk about supply side policies and then you'd link it at the end to development. Yeah, so a bit of a twist on it. Then 2017, discuss looser fiscal policy and supply side reforms that the governments can use to increase economic growth. So 2017, pretty much the exact same question as this. This is why you need to go through these past papers. And the harsh reality is the students who don't attempt these past papers, who don't try write these essays, make a model answer. So if this question comes up again, they know exactly how to answer it. They will score exponentially worse than the students who are doing the hard work, doing the boring past papers, but using these videos to try and improve and help them reach that A star. There just will be no comparison, and you can just tell that in the depth they respond. The first time you're writing a supply side policy question, there'll be so many gaps, especially with real world application in the chain of analysis, but repeating it, doing it 1, 2, 3 times, improving from every single time, you'll get up to a point where if a supply side policy question comes up, you pretty much know exactly how to answer it and you can smash it out of the park. Now, straight from the Edexcel exam board, in response to this question in 2024, they said it's clear that this question is well rehearsed and we saw some excellent responses. Now, to emphasise this point, remember grade boundaries are relative. They depend on the cohort and how the cohort performs on that particular question or that particular paper, which is a deficit you're going to have to make up in probably a harder question, which is of course a lot harder to do. So this is really about these popular questions, these high yield questions. You need to practice them. But anyway, let's actually get on with the question. First things first, also, the question doesn't just say supply side policy, it says policies. So to reach that level 3, you will also need to reference 2 different policies to, like I said, to get anywhere close to that 15 marks. Now, also, before we get started with the question, this is of course a section B question, so you would normally think I need to use the extract for the application, but in reality, we've looked through the entire extract. The only real bit of application is this last bit of extract B, I believe it is, where it mentions how the government have a 20 billion plan to spend on like carbon capture, which create new jobs. But this again emphasizes to get these application marks around 50-mark question, 3 marks there for application, you need to also know your own examples, you need to know your own industries, your own real-world example of supply-side policy, and maybe some stats, some figures to back that up. So I have gone through the supply-side policy of apprenticeship subsidies in a previous 15-mark question, but this time I actually will type it up so you guys can see the full extended chain of analysis and exactly how I would write it. But let's get started with this. So how would the apprenticeship subsidy act as a supply-side policy which could stimulate economic growth? So firstly, what type of supply-side policy is an apprenticeship subsidy? And that's probably how I would do my 2 paragraphs. I'll probably do one on a market-based and one on an interventionist. And of course, if you don't know that, market-based is where the government decreases intervention in the market, and then of course an interventionist when they increase intervention in the market. And of course, a subsidy would be increasing intervention in the market. They're getting more involved in the market, more involved in the price mechanism. Therefore, so yeah, apprenticeship subsidy is an example of an interventionist supply-side policy. This apprenticeship levy was introduced in 2017, where large employers pay 0.5% of their wage bill to fund this training. Now that is a great start. Another great start you can throw in 2022/23, there were 337,000 apprenticeships started. So how does this apprenticeship subsidy actually work? So just like any other subsidy, it lowers the cost. And for firms, it lowers the cost for training. Therefore, if it's lower cost to train apprentices, it means firms are more incentivized and they're more likely to take on apprentices. Thus, meaning the quantity of apprentices taken on due to the subsidy increases. Now, of course, if more firms are taking on apprentices, if there's an increased quantity of apprenticeships, it will mean that the level of skills in the UK workforce, in the UK population, is improving. Another really good bit of real-world application you can link this to is let's think about who benefits the most from these apprenticeship schemes. So the most common people who go into, the most common individuals who go into apprenticeships are 16 and 18 year olds, so maybe fresh out of GCSEs or fresh after A level. Now why does this matter? As this is the young workforce, and the young workforce face disproportionately higher levels of unemployment than the national average. For example, in 2023, youth unemployment was 11%, whilst the national average was 4%. So that's over 7 percentage points higher unemployment rates. Now, another factor that compounds this, if you think about the demographic of the UK population, again, real world application, The UK has a massive ageing population crisis. There's lots of old people. And what does that also mean? It means more people are retiring. And these individuals, these workers who are retiring, they are essentially at the top of their skill set. They've had 20, 30, 40 years of experience and now are leaving the workforce. Therefore, we're losing those skills, we're losing those expertise, and most importantly, we're losing those workers. But apprenticeships also help solve that problem as well. The aging population is therefore being replaced by new young workers who are retiring, since we do have an aging population crisis. Now back to the main chain of analysis. The increased level of skills will therefore, we say, increases the level of human capital. And if there is a higher level of human capital within the UK, it means there's an increase in productivity. And what do I always say? What does productivity mean? It's output per unit time. And if there's an increase in output per unit time and per worker, so every worker is more productive, every worker can produce more goods and services per unit time. What is that going to improve? Of course, that is going to increase the real GDP, as what is real GDP? It's the amount of goods and services produced in the UK. And if per unit time we can produce more, of course the quantity of goods and services will increase. But essentially the end bit is that increase in real GDP. And just the written down version, increase in human capital, increase in the level of human capital, increases labour productivity. And what does labour productivity mean? If labour is more productive, they have more output per unit time. And if there's more output per unit time per worker, it means firms can produce more goods and services. And of course, if firms can produce more goods and services, it leads to an increase in real GDP. And then of course, it would not be a supply side policy question if you did not include a good amount of diagrammatic analysis. So of course, price level on your y-axis, real GDP on your x-axis, would draw a nice LRAS, and then shifting that LRAS out, of course, so LRAS1, LRAS, then also AD and shifting out AD. Then also you have a nice little AD curve, and of course make sure you label up the points. So we see PL1, I'll label that, and then YE, and then of course we see the increase in real GDP from YE to Y1, so of course 100% label that up on your diagram, mention it on your diagram, make sure to label up the rest, and we see a little bit of deflation, or you might call it disinflation. So of course the increase in productivity, the increased skills in the workforce would cause that LRAS to shift out. So of course it won't be a supply side policy question if you did not include a diagram. So use your diagrammatic analysis. So this increase in labour productivity, this increase in human capital, essentially the increase in productivity would cause our LRAS to now shift out to LRAS1, and that of course would lead to the increase in real GDP from YE to Y1. And what is an increase in real GDP also called? That is economic growth, which you can end your chain of analysis on there. And if you really want to mention and you want to add a bit more, you can also shift out the AD to AD1, AD2, and you can mention how if workers are more productive, they have more bargaining power, they can demand higher wages. This increases level of consumption in the economy. If workers are more productive, it means more output per unit time, more goods and services being produced. Firms are making more profit, they're more likely to invest more, increases consumption in the economy. And of course, with the government subsidising this interventionist scheme, this apprenticeship subsidy, it also means the level of government spending is increasing. So you get an increase in C, an increase in I, an increase in G. You can also say an increase in exports. Of course, we're making more goods and services, so we can export more. So of course, it does lead to an increase in AD, and again, more economic growth. Now look at this absolute piece of beauty I've crafted for you guys. So I've written up that entire chain of analysis to make sure, of course my handwriting it gets a bit dodgy sometimes. But yeah, this is just the epitome of A star. Like everything about this says A star. Beautiful KA, beautiful diagram. Like I said, you don't actually need to add the second link to AD. You can just leave it with one AD curve. But of course, this 15-mark question is not done, and this paragraph is not done without evaluation. So let's move on to the evaluation stage of this paragraph. Now, the first evaluation point, and the absolute classic with regards to supply side policies, is of course, however in evaluation, this depends on the time lag. One underrated thing I want to mention about practicing past papers is students will look at section B's and look at the Edexcel paper as a whole and think this is almost impossible to do under time pressure to an A-star level. But this is where the A-star students aren't just A-star students because they can write the chain of analysis. Is since they've gone through these past papers so many times, when they're sitting the actual paper, there's so many questions that are very similar that they can just almost, instead of having to rethink an entirely new chain of analysis, instead of having to think new evaluation points, they can pretty much just recall once they've already written and chain of analysis they've already written. Therefore, another massive underrated thing, it massively increases their speed. Now, in my own experience, the top level of students, the pinnacle of the A-stars, that is one big reason why they do not actually struggle with timing, since they've just got so many reps of these questions. They know exactly how to do these chains of analysis that at one stage it essentially becomes recall, where they're just recalling chains of analysis, they're just recalling evaluation points, instead of actually having to think about them and think about the process and think about the chain. It's just simple recall. But anyway, back to this. However, in valuation, this depends on the time lag. As of course, we usually say any economic policy that we implement takes around 12 to 18 months to have any effect inside the economy. And this apprenticeship subsidy, of course, the effects of increased productivity, the effects of LRS increasing, of course, are in the long run. So it could take even longer than 18 months. And of course, subsidising these firms is going to be quite costly for the government, and especially depends on the stage of the business cycle the UK government is in, and also depends on how the government's fiscal balances are. If the UK is in a fiscal deficit, if they're in a budget deficit, subsidising these firms, providing the supply side policy, is going to be extremely taxing. And of course, in the short run, it's going to worsen the fiscal deficit, but the positive effects will only be seen in the long run. So 100%, the stimulating economic growth does depend on the time frame, as it takes 12 to 18 months for the government policy to be implemented to see any sort of effects in the economy. So therefore, in the short run, we will not actually see any positive effects on economic growth. And of course, that little bit to the fiscal deficit, you can link that to this being an interventionist policy. Since of course, interventionist policy, they usually use some of the government budget, they usually use government spending, whilst market-based policies, they usually either don't use government spending or somehow generate tax revenue. Now, another classic one, I'm not going to go much in depth with, is opportunity cost. Of course, these funds could be allocated elsewhere and it could be more effective. For example, you could even say the carbon capture, for however in valuation, they could allocate these resources to the carbon capture, which with cleaner electricity generation technology could be more effective. Also, more specific points like the quality of apprenticeships that they're subsidising, since there's lots of employers who use apprenticeship schemes just for really cheap labour and do not actually focus much on training these individuals. Therefore, if the level of training is not satisfactory or is not high enough, yes, the government are subsidising lots of apprenticeships, but the workers are not becoming highly skilled, their level of human capital is not increasing, thus of course limiting the degree to which economic growth, which real GDP increases. Also, another really simple but great evaluation point, the question is asking how supply side policies could stimulate economic growth. Economic growth, why do we want economic growth? Of course, it's a government objective. So then what else, how else could we evaluate this? We could say the trade-offs with other government objectives. And if you look at this diagram, with both LRS and AD shifting out, we're getting some quite substantial inflation. So you could say, however, in evaluation, this depends on the trade-off with other macro objectives, as it could lead to high levels of demand pull inflation. That's a really good evaluation point. Or if you want to word it a different way, maybe it leads to a budget deficit. Then you could mention the interventionist policy uses government spending and the opportunity cost of that. And yeah, that is how I would do the first paragraph for this 15-mark question. I'm not going to bore you and do another paragraph. You can just pick whatever other policy. The chain of analysis is very simple. Just make sure you know another policy, another type of supply side policy. Section C, 2024, paper 2. Let's get right on with it. Evaluate macroeconomic policies that could be used to reduce a current account deficit. Refer to a country of your choice in your answer. So this sounds like a really good 25-mark question, quite a unique one. Let's have a look at the stimulus. So it talks about Brazil's current account deficit. It gives you a good figure, it's 46.12 billion. Central bank tried to intervene by selling its own currency, which of course one strategy we can use to reduce the current account deficit. It's first time it's intervened in its foreign currency markets since 2021. What does that suggest? This suggests a managed exchange rate, doesn't it? As if you can recall, a floating exchange rate is left completely to the market, so the market supply and demand determines the value of the currency, whilst a managed exchange rate, it means that the central bank would intervene to try influence the value of the currency, which of course this stimulus suggests Brazil is a managed exchange rate. And of course, like I emphasised, real world application. Here again, you need to know a really good country fact file, maybe one or two here for like 2 different paragraphs, to be able to comment on the current account deficit and how we can use a policy to improve the current account deficit. So definitely just shows the need for real world application. But yeah, let's get started and let's have a shot at answering this. Now, I really think this is a great question, especially for revision, for practice. Such a common current account question and really test your knowledge on it. But let's get started with a few of the policies, since there's a range of policies. There's lots of different ways you can go about answering this question. First thing first, of course, what is a stimulus referring to? When the central bank has intervened to sell its own currency. Of course, that is all to do with foreign currency reserves. As of course, countries can use their foreign currency reserves. For example, China has around $3 trillion in their foreign currency reserves. They can sell off their domestic currency, so the yuan in this example, and by selling off their domestic currency, what does it mean? It depreciates the exchange rate, shifts out the supply curve for the currency, depreciates the exchange rate, and of course a depreciated currency, if you think about spicy, the opposite of spicy, weaker pound, imports expensive, exports cheaper, therefore of course improving the current account. Therefore that could be a really solid paragraph, especially of course adding a lot more detail to it, a lot more application. But yeah, that is definitely my first point. Now of course there are definitely other ways we can depreciate this exchange rate, and I'm sure one that a lot of you guys would be thinking is of course expansionary monetary policy. So therefore of course we reduce the interest rates, and why would a reduction in interest rates depreciate our exchange rate? Since of course a reduction in interest rates is all to do with hot money flows, as with the reduced interest rates it's less lucrative for foreign investors to invest into, for example, the UK. Therefore they invest less into the UK and they try to pull their money out of the UK, therefore increase the supply of pounds, therefore depreciates the UK's exchange rate. And that is definitely another policy you can use to depreciate the exchange rate. So yeah, 100% if you want to use it, expansion monetary policy is a totally valid way of going about this question. And the way I would decide which one to use, just think about for you, which can you develop the longer chain of analysis for, and as the one that you can develop the longer, the more developed chain of analysis, you're more likely to pick up marks, and that's how to distinguish between good points. Now the second policy I am going to use in this question is all to do with a very small part of the spec, which is expenditure reducing and expenditure switching policies. And this is why I always say these 25 mark questions, they're always somehow linked, since the expenditure reducing policies examples are things like tariffs, things like subsidies to domestic producers, and of course what are they? They're all in the topic of globalization. And what is the second 25 mark question? It's on globalization also. But yeah, so which policy would I use? So for the expenditure reducing policies, a great one of course is tariffs, and I'm sure a lot of you guys are very comfortable, are very well versed in the tariff chain of analysis. Just a little mistake there, I said the wrong thing and somehow wrote the wrong thing as well. Tariffs, subsidies to domestic producers would in fact be examples of expenditure switching policies, as expenditure reducing policies are they're fairly negative, they're not really used a lot. They're things like contractionary policies, like contractionary fiscal, contractionary monetary. Why contractionary policies? They're just contracting the economy, they decrease real GDP, therefore individuals have less disposable income, can spend less consumption, thus of course they curb consumption. But also the massive problem with expenditure reducing policies is that of course if there's less GDP is a really good indicator, well it's an indicator for living standards. So if you're pursuing contractionary policies to try to reduce spending, you're also just worsening living standards. Individuals cannot buy as many goods and services they want and need, and what's that another word for? They demand. Therefore if individuals can't buy goods and services they want and demand, you talk about consumer welfare, consumer surplus obviously massively decreases, and overall real GDP and living standards decrease. But back onto this. Expenditure switching policies like tariffs. Like I said, a lot of you guys are well versed in tariffs. I am briefly going to go through this tariff paragraph. What I want to try to give you with this question, there's several past papers I've gone through now, done the exact tariff diagram, perfect A-star level, with the exact chain analysis. I want to give you guys more of a diverse portfolio, so if a hard question comes up, you guys have lots of different ways to answer the question, lots of different A-star chains of analysis. So I will briefly go through tariffs, but I am going to focus this paragraph on subsidies to domestic producers. So instead of being like a one-trick pony, several different A-star top-level diagrams, chains of analysis, so any sort of difficult, maybe curveball question, you can navigate it. And this is why year on year in the live classes, we're basically just pumping out A-stars. We're essentially, at You Do Econ, the McDonald's produces beef burgers, we just produce economic A-star students. So of course the question is asking us to refer to a country of our choice when we're talking about this expenditure switching policy. So how would I go about it? One macroeconomic policy that could, and I'm going to go through this really briefly like I said, one macroeconomic policy that could be used to reduce the current account deficit is an expenditure switching policy, such as imposing a tariff. Of course, a tariff is a tax on imports, and let's stop the chain of analysis there. I'm going to give an example first, state your point, then application. So for example, a great example of this is the US-China trade war, still going on now in 2025. Now, of course, the US current account deficit didn't just magically disappear when they set these tariffs, but it massively decreased, it significantly decreased that current account deficit between US and China. As for example, during 2019, the imports from China into the US decreased around 20%, which is of course very significant. What does that mean? Massive reduction in import expenditure, and if the massive reduction in import expenditure, of course, improves that trade balance and thus improves that current account deficit. So quick, simple tariff chain analysis. What is a tariff? It's tax on imports. This therefore makes imports more expensive. If imports are more expensive, what is going to happen? The quantity imported will reduce. Of course, show this all in the tariff diagram. Again, think about the other things on the tariff diagram, like consumer surplus, of course, can be shown when imports are more expensive. There's a reduction in consumer consumer surplus, but how do consumers respond to the more expensive imports? Lots of them will switch from importing goods to now consuming goods which are domestically produced. So buying goods from domestic producers, which of course, if you can imagine on the diagram, I'm going to literally do it with my hands. The gap used to be this, Q1 to Q4, and now the gap is this. So the quantity imported reduces. As like I said, consumers are substituting to domestic producers instead of importing, thus reducing import expenditure. And like I said, at the end of the chain, it reduces the current account deficit. And just for those of you who want to add a bit more detail there, of course, with a tariff, and with the current account, there's imports and exports. And with tariffs, you are mostly focusing on the quantity imported, but you can comment on the exports for these producers now. So you could just say exports remain relatively the same, but also you could talk about maybe a different time frame. In the long run, these domestic producers, as they're going to experience an increase in demand by domestic producers. This, if you think about economies of scale, again in macro, that's a great diagram to draw. Yes, it's a micro diagram, but has many links to the macro, and 100% a great and a relevant diagram to draw. Domestic consumers are increasing demand for domestically produced goods. This of course means domestic producers are making more sales, more revenue, and therefore could be making more profits. And of course, with them experiencing higher demand, there's more output, and as we know, what are economies of scale? How do you define economy of scale? When output increases, we can also say long run average cost falls. So you could say in the long run, exports could become more competitive. Why? Since these domestic firms could now experience economies of scale, which is obviously a really good point. So it means the import expenditure is decreasing. The export revenue, since exports are more competitive, since they are cheaper on global markets, will increase, thus of course improving the current account deficit. And of course you can relate it again back to the US, where it meant that the current account deficit with China did reduce. And if you want to be specific, you can say the bilateral deficit between US and China was reduced. But like I said, I've done the tariff trade analysis, done the diagram, whole explanation before in other past paper videos, and I want to give you guys like diversity. You have a really good depth of knowledge, a really good depth of different A-star chains, and this is exactly what builds that A-star student. Since this is why in the community we get a record number of A-stars every single year, since we just make sure you're prepared to the highest level, they can throw anything at you and you'll still be able to smash it out. Like for example, this recent 2025 paper, especially if you're on social media, a lot of you guys might have seen everyone's talking about how these year's A-levels have been extremely hard. Our students were completely fine with it. We prepare you for literally everything, so there's nothing to worry about. But let's get back on with the question, and specifically with the second, and the one I'm going to go into detail with. The second expenditure is switching policy, which is subsidies to domestic producers. So let's get started. Straight from the examiners, straight from Edexcel. The first thing they said, this was a good point, so subsidies to domestic producers, but the main thing students were limited on was the diagram. A lot of students just drew a subsidy, like a micro, a year 12 diagram, but that is not going to cut it with this. Of course, for this question, and again for your depth of knowledge, you should in fact know a trade subsidy diagram, and since that was one of the main things examiners did pick up on, let's start with the trade subsidy diagram. I don't know why I'm drawing it in green, but yeah, let's get started. So of course we have just our curves. So y-axis, x-axis, and trade subsidy diagram is exactly the same. It's just price, quantity. Essentially, it just looks like a tariff diagram, but then you just add a subsidy to it. So let's show you how this looks like. So it's S, and like I said, just like a tariff diagram, supply, and that is domestic. Then we have demand, which of course D, and D domestic, and then we would, just like in a tariff diagram, we would draw our world price or world supply, then we label that world price. Now, how does this differ from a tariff diagram? So this, for most of you, will look like an incompleted tariff diagram, or for those of you that know, this would also look like a free trade diagram, which is of course a really good diagram for you guys to memorize. Well, it literally just is this, but it's a good diagram to be able to reference. But now, how would we add the subsidy to this diagram? So it looks something like this essentially. You just pick a random quantity, you go from there, you do something like this, and so that is not a good point, so I'm going to do that again. So I'm just going to go a bit wider. That looks good. So make sure it's perpendicular, and this would now be S supply domestic plus subsidy, and let's just add on our points. So just going to extend that out. That is now Q3, and this is the new price, world price plus sub. Main thing students get confused on each year with this diagram are these two prices. If you really want to, and you don't want to learn anything more, just ignore this price, and you can just focus on this. Essentially, for consumers, the price does not change at all. The price is always going to be at world price, or whatever you want to call that. But what does this price then represent? It represents the new effective price for producers after the subsidy. But now let's answer the question. So one macroeconomic policy that could be used to reduce a current account deficit is the expenditure reducing policy of subsidising domestic producers. Now, like I say, state your point, move on to application before starting the chain of analysis. Why is the perfect paragraph structure state your point, application, then analysis, since we want that consistency? And this is just built from hundreds, probably even thousands of students now, just testing the students, since if you put the application before your analysis, you're much more likely to remember it. A lot of students will get to nearly the end of the paragraph and forget to add any application. So at least, of course, embed application in your chains of analysis, but at least if you've got that just after your point, you've pretty much consistently including application in every single one of your paragraphs. And that's exactly what you need for that top level. Now the question is asking, refer to a country of your choice, and a great example I do teach on subsidising domestic producers, and I'm sure a lot of you will know this, is in fact the, you might know it as CAP, or the Common Agricultural Policy within the EU. What does this do? Essentially, it's just subsidising EU farmers. They give EU farmers money, which of course relates to our example perfectly. Now, more specifically, in the example I teach in the live classes is Romania. Romania is one of the biggest receivers of this CAP, the Common Agricultural Subsidy. They receive about between 2023 and 2027, they're estimated to receive 20 billion worth of the subsidy. So of course it works quite well. And the reason why we are specifically choosing Romania also does have a current account deficit. Therefore, it works almost perfectly for this question. Of course, I always say to my students, you chose Edexcel, well, you're doing Edexcel, and one of the biggest precursors with Edexcel is that depth, that just massive need for real-world application, countries, fact files, industries. You need to know all of them to a really good extent and be able to relate them to the question. As I'm telling you, I see top-level students every single year. I see hundreds of them every single year. The top level of students can do this, and they are the students who consistently, year on year, are achieving the A-star. So if you cannot do it, you will not be one of those A-star or even A students. So we've done the application, now let's move on to the analysis. So point, application, analysis, let's get started. So what is happening? So the government has subsidised domestic producers. When the government subsidises these domestic producers, of course, it reduces the cost of production for these domestic producers. How can we see this on the diagram? We can see this on the diagram, of course, from when SD, supply domestic, shifts outwards to now SD plus subsidy. Now, a good thing to remember is the vertical distance between the supply domestic, just like a normal subsidy diagram, the vertical distance between these two would represent the cost per unit of the subsidy. Or you could say the value of the subsidy per unit. But by the government subsidising this firm, or these firms, it means that now what has happened to the quantities, which is the most important thing. Since if you look at this just as a classic trade diagram, of course, what would the quantity show? Initially, it shows the quantity imported is between Q1 and Q2. So that represents, just like we would label on a tariff diagram, it represents the quantity imported. But now, after the government has now subsidised these firms, it's caused the supply curve shift out to SD plus subsidy, we now have a new quantity of Q3. Therefore, it means that the quantity imported has now decreased. So initially we were at Q1, Q2, and again, I need to emphasise, you need to use these points in your analysis. If you're not mentioning these points in your analysis, you're just leaving marks on the table. So you need to make sure one of the biggest things, make sure all these little points you include, WP, Q1, Q2, Q3, mention them all in your chain of analysis, spam them in. But now, the quantity imported decreases from Q1 to Q2 to now Q3, Q2, which is a new quantity imported after domestic producers have been subsidised. And why is that? That is because consumers have now substituted away from importing goods to now just purchasing from domestic producers. So the increase in domestic producer supply has substituted for the need of imports. Now, for the high level students, there is a really cool thing you can show on this diagram. So you can show the difference between the boxes of domestic producer revenue before the subsidy and after the subsidy. So before the subsidy, the domestic producer revenue was this box here, so WPQ1. But now, after the subsidy, the domestic producer revenue is now this much larger box. And that, of course, shows the incentive and shows why these firms, these subsidized firms, are deciding to produce a higher quantity. And if you want to do in your exam, you could label WPAB and say, so the domestic producer revenue has increased from WPABQ1 to now WP plus S C Q3D, something like that. But now, of course, with import demand decreasing, it will lead to the classical chain of analysis, less import expenditure, less demand for foreign currencies, therefore improving our trade balance, and thus the main thing, improving Romania's current account deficit. And of course, at the end, just link it back to the question. So less import demand is of course going to lead to less import expenditure. There's going to be less foreign currency transactions, better trade balance. And the main thing we're linking it to, it improves Romania's current account deficit, which is currently sitting at 8.3% of Romania's GDP. And I hope you guys can see that is not a hard paragraph, very similar to your trade, your tariff diagrams, just a bit of a twist on it. Make sure you know the diagram to a good extent. If you want me to, leave a comment. I can do a full video on how to construct this diagram. But yeah, a really good one, and a good one to practice to make sure you're comfortable with also saying you're comfortable with the paragraph of subsidising domestic producers. Let's now move on to the evaluation stage of the paragraph. And the first one, and a really great one, specifically to do with subsidising domestic producers. This is why I emphasise you have to practice different paragraphs. You have to practice different chains of analysis, since this is a really specific and a really good evaluation point for this diagram, for this paragraph. And it means that if you practice them in your exam, if this question comes up, you can rewrite, you can pretty much recall this exact one. But the way the word is, however, in evaluation, this depends on the degree of retaliation. As when the EU subsidises via the Common Agriculture Policy, when they subsidise these Romanian farmers, this distorts the theory of comparative advantage. And why is that? Since these farmers do not have a comparative advantage in producing, they don't have the lowest opportunity cost in farming. For example, there might be farmers across the world who have a lower opportunity cost of producing these these agricultural goods, whereas by the EU subsidising them, they're artificially giving them lower costs, therefore distorting the theory of comparative advantage, which in fact we can see on this diagram, which this triangle here is a triangle, just like on your tariff diagram you would see a triangle of deadweight welfare loss. This is also deadweight welfare loss of efficiency, and this would therefore trigger retaliation. So for example, if your country had the comparative advantage in farming, maybe you had a big farming exporting sector, and now EU is giving billions out in subsidies, it would trigger some sort of response, which is retaliation. And for example, a great example of this is the EU's CAP, so the Common Agricultural Policy, versus the US's retaliation, as the US realised that with the EU's new policy of CAP, they are basically dominating the markets. They're flooding the agriculture markets. So the US responded. They tried to go through the WTO, but then they ended up responding themselves with the Farm Bill, which is essentially just a retaliation measure to the EU's Common Agricultural Policy. And how does this relate to the question? This retaliation can lead to trade barriers like tariffs. Therefore, it could actually, if for example, if Romania import lots from the US, due to this policy, it could lead to high tariffs the US set on Romania, thus meaning if Romanian consumers import lots from the US, it could actually lead to a worsened current account rather than a improved current account. So it could worsen the current account deficit due to retaliation by foreign countries rather than bettering or making the current account better. So in summary, by the EU subsidising its Romanian farmers, it distorts the theory of comparative advantage. This can lead to countries like the US responding, and that could actually, in the end, lead to a worsened current account deficit due to things like tariffs, trade barriers, if, for example, Romanian consumers import lots from countries like the US or whichever country sets trade barriers on them. So there's a bit of a more complex evaluation point, but nonetheless, a very, very detailed and very specific evaluation point. And of course, you're using the diagram in it, you're using the diagram you've drawn, it says top marks, absolute top level evaluation point. And of course, all the subsidies evaluation points you've learned in micro, they still work quite well here as well. For example, a great one here is that, yes, we've got an increase in quantity, and we're assuming that this increase in quantity supplied by domestic producers is going to lead to a reduction in the quantity imported from Q1, Q2 to now Q3, Q2. But this also doesn't just depend on the quantity, it depends on the quality. Since if these domestic producers are just producing absolute garbage, yes, they can produce lots of it, but will domestic consumers actually purchase? Probably not. So it will not actually reduce the quantity imported. So the current account improving doesn't just depend on whether the domestic producers increase their supply, so produce more quantity. It also depends on what they're actually producing, the quality of what they are producing. Also, a great evaluation point specifically to do with the application with the Common Agricultural Policy. One thing we saw, especially in the 1980s, as a few of you might know, is massive overproduction. So in the EU, if you type in wine lakes and butter mountains, they're known from when in 1980s, 1990s, since EU farmers were subsidised, they basically produced way too much and led to massive wastage, massive just dumping on international markets of these resources, and just a lot of it was just had to be destroyed since they just produce way too much. So that is, of course, allocative inefficiency is a massive wastage, which subsidies, and will not, also massive thing, will not help improve the current account deficit. And then you could of course comment on the next best alternative. Instead of them subsidizing these firms, and these firms ending up wasting it, they could have spent that on another policy, an alternative policy, like something like, since remember, also big thing that just popped into my mind is subsidies cost the government money, don't they? It costs the government to provide a subsidy. That is the trade barrier. Whereas if they used an alternative policy like tariffs, instead of costing the government, they bring in government revenue. So you could say the cost of the next best alternative, the cost of subsidies, the opportunity cost, you could have instead pursued tariffs. So essentially, instead of using a subsidy which uses up tax revenue, they could have used tariffs which makes tax revenue. Now, like I always say, there's several different evaluation points you can go into depth with and pick up top marks for, but they're just some examples of what I was thinking. Now, let's move on to the second paragraph and construct that A-star chain of analysis for this one. Let's get on with the second paragraph. One macroeconomic policy that could be used to reduce a current account deficit is foreign currency reserves. Why? Since they depreciate the exchange rate. For example, China holds around 3 trillion worth of foreign currencies, and for you students, to put that into some perspective, the UK holds around 118 billion. That is just 3.5% of what China holds. So every $1 the UK has in foreign currency reserves, the China has $29, which of course shows why China is a heavyweight on forex market. So now we've done the point application, now onto the analysis, and here I'm just explaining how foreign currency reserves work. So the Central Bank of China will sell their domestic currency, which is yuan, and this is as China has a managed exchange rate system, just like we mentioned a long time ago now, but we mentioned that Brazil also has a managed exchange rate system. But what will they do? They'll, on forex markets, they will buy foreign currency with their own domestic currency. Now, by using their domestic currency on the forex market, what are they doing? They're essentially increasing the supply of the yuan. And what can we show that on? Of course, we can show that on a diagram. Now, what diagram is this? This is the exchange rate diagram. Now, this is a great diagram I emphasize students to make sure you remember, since it's very simple, just essentially a supply and demand diagram with exchange rate on the y-axis and quantity of yuan or whatever currency you're referring to on the x-axis. And here, so we just have our supply and demand, and like we said, we're going to get an increase in supply of yuan, so thus causing supply to shift to S plus 1. Now let's see what effect is that having on the axes. And so let's start from our original equilibrium, which is ER1, and now Q1, and then with the shift out of supply, what's going to happen? Of course, if we now see exchange rate has decreased from ER1 to ER2, and like I just said, we would call that a depreciation, and quantity has also increased. The yuan has depreciated. Let's think about spicy now. So exports are going to become cheaper. If exports are cheaper, they are more internationally competitive, thus export revenue will rise. And let's think about the opposite side of the spectrum, imports. Imports are now more expensive, thus import expenditure will now decrease. And of course, that is the perfect scenario. We have less imports, more export expenditure, thus meaning that, of course, the trade balance improves and we narrow that current account deficit. Now, before you guys get on to me, of course, China does not have a current account deficit, and I'm also aware of this. And this is why it also works as a great evaluation point here. So one really good evaluation point I would use here is use a real world application. As theoretically, yeah, it makes sense that we've said that China's current account deficit is narrowing, but in reality, we all know that China does not have a current account deficit. So would this, you could comment on whether this will be ineffective, whether China would realistically, they would never use a policy like this, since they don't need to pursue an improvement of their current account. But now moving on to probably the best evaluation point, especially for this question, and the one you guys have been waiting for, is of course to do the Marshall learning condition, the J-curve. And how would I word this evaluation point? However, in evaluation, the depreciation of the currency improving the current account deficit depends on the time frame. And of course, the main thing to use in conjunction with this is the infamous diagram. I love it because it's a bit different to the normal diagrams. What's on our axis is of course balance, and make sure you draw this out, write this out fully, balance of payments on the current account on the y-axis, and then on your x-axis is of course time. Then we have positive, we have negative current account, and of course the J-curve looks something like this. And you try to get the point where it goes from being, well, it starts sloping upwards, and this point here, of course, you could label this the Marshall, this is where the Marshall learning condition is satisfied. And what does that mean? What is the Marshall learning condition itself? Is with the PED of exports plus the PED of imports is now greater than 1. So that is the difference. This little very dodgy line by me, but this is the difference in the short run and the long run. So let's go back. However, in evaluation, depreciation of a currency improving the current account deficit depends on the time frame. But before we get into it, this is why it's important to check my diagram, since I did check it just before I was about to start speaking, and I did realise I have made a mistake here. So firstly, that's just like a little error where I've wrote 0 instead of putting negative, but the J curve is technically meant to start below, so start at negative. So I did accidentally write that above. It is probably because I am teaching and I'm speaking at the same time, so I'm a bit distracted. But yeah, so it should just start below the shouldn't start in the positive side. As shown by the J curve, in the short run, the current account deficit actually gets worse. And why is this? This is as demand for imports, we say in the short run, is inelastic. As for example, firms are tied down to contracts. So we have a really bad combination where we have firms, since they're tied down to contracts, they're importing the same quantity, and then we have a depreciated currency. So essentially now they need to spend more of that currency to get the same amount of imports. Thus, of course, as we can see on the J-curve diagram, it means that in the short run, our current account deficit gets worse. But then in the long run, the demand for imports becomes more elastic, as for example, firms have time, the contract's now expired, they have time to negotiate a better deal contract, thus meaning, as you can see, the deficit on the current account improves. But of course, this all is based on the fact, and it's based on the assumption that the Marshall learning condition is met, which is when the PED of exports plus the PED of imports is greater than 1. But of course, make sure you know the Marshall learning condition in depth, you know how to draw the diagram, you know how to word the chain analysis, you know what the Marshall learning condition actually means. And like I will say, depth of understanding with these diagrams is absolutely key for you to be able to demonstrate that knowledge, develop those chains of analysis, pick up those evaluation marks. But yeah, there are two of the main evaluation points I would use for this paragraph. Like I said, there's a lot more you can go through.